welcome back to the Fame Box. Let's open this one together. You know that feeling when a show catches you completely off guard? When you sit down expecting something light and easy and instead the thing just reaches through the screen and grabs you? That's exactly what The Wonderfools did to me, and I've been thinking about it ever since I finished it. So today, we're doing something I've been genuinely excited about. We are opening this box all the way. Every layer, every choice, every detail that hit differently the second time through. If you've already seen The Wonderfuls and you want to understand why it works as well as it does, you're in the right place. And if you haven't seen it yet, stay with me through the first half. I'm going to give you every reason to press play tonight. This is the film box, and as always, every film is a box. We open it together. Before we even get to what happens in this story, let me tell you something that will completely change how you see every single scene. Because here's what most people miss. The Wonderfuls didn't arrive out of nowhere. This thing has a history. A wild, winding, surprisingly emotional history that spans nearly 8 years, two completely different creative visions, and a connection to one of the most legendary names in comic book storytelling that most casual viewers have absolutely no idea about. When you know how this box was built, you see it with entirely different eyes. So before we go inside, let's talk about what's on the outside first. Here is something genuinely fascinating. The story that eventually became The Wonderfuls began not as a Korean original, but as an adaptation of a concept developed by Stan Lee himself. That name, the creator of Spider-Man, Iron Man, the X-Men, is stamped in this project's DNA from its very earliest days. According to reports and historical production records, back in 2018, Lee's production company, POW Entertainment, was attached to an early version of the series, then going by the working title The B Team. The concept at that point was reportedly built around B-rated superheroes, flawed, second string, underpowered individuals, pitted against a mad scientist who had created them in the first place. That is a very specific and very Stan Lee kind of premise. There is something almost poetic about the fact that the man who gave us lovable misfits with uncontrollable powers, your Peter Parkers, your mutants who never asked for what they became, was the seed at the center of what eventually grew into the Wonderfuls. Even though the final show departed significantly from that original concept, the emotional fingerprint of Stan Lee's sensibility is still visible in the DNA of these characters. Ordinary people, extraordinary problems, powers that feel less like gifts and more like disasters waiting to happen. That lineage matters. And knowing it changes how you read these characters, not as Korean superhero archetypes, but as part of a much longer, much more global conversation about what it really means to be gifted with something you cannot control. Now, the second thing you need to know before we enter the story is about the creative team, because this production brought together some of the most accomplished names working in Korean television today, and that combination is no accident. Director Eun-sik has built a reputation over decades as someone who understands how to balance genuine emotional weight with crowd-pleasing entertainment. His fingerprints are on Extraordinary Attorney Woo's, which became one of the most globally watched Korean dramas of its era, and before that, The Doctor, romantic series, and the high-octane action thriller Vagabond. What connects all of those different shows is not genre. It's a commitment to making you care about people before anything spectacular happens to them. Yoo In-sik is a director who earns the spectacle by building the humanity first, and that approach is exactly what the Wonderfuls needed. Because if you don't care about these clumsy, chaotic, deeply flawed people before they get their powers, none of the action means anything. The director understood that, and it shows in every choice the show makes in its opening episodes. The third production detail worth knowing is about writer Heo Da-jung, who is perhaps best known as one of the creative forces behind Extreme Job, a Korean film that broke box office records and became one of the most beloved comedies the country had produced in years. What Extreme Job proved about Hyeda-jung was that he understands a very specific kind of comedy, the kind that comes from people being absolutely terrible at the very thing they're supposed to do and somehow succeeding anyway through sheer stubborn persistence and human warmth. That is also exactly the comedy engine powering the Wonderfools. These characters don't become heroes because they get good at being heroes. They become heroes because they refuse to stop trying, even when they're absolutely disastrous at it. Hyo Tatong brought that same spirit across, and once you know that lineage, the comedic rhythm of the show makes much more sense. It isn't random chaos, it's a carefully constructed engine of lovable failure. The fourth thing that reframes the entire viewing experience is the production timeline itself. This was not a fast show to make. Filming reportedly ran from October 2024 all the way through to June 2005. A full 8 months of principal photography, which for a Korean drama production is a substantial commitment. And even after that, the post production process was extended significantly because of the superhero visual effects work required. The team apparently needed extra time to ensure the CGI sequences met the standard the story demanded. According to production reports, Netflix and the production company were careful not to rush this element. Why does that matter to you as a viewer? Because when you watch the action sequences in The Wonderfuls, you're watching the result of a team that insisted on getting it right rather than getting it done fast. The show's visual effects are not spectacular in the way $100 million Hollywood production would be, but they are consistent, thoughtful, and always in service of the comedy and the emotion rather than competing with it. That restraint was a choice, and it was the right one. The fifth production fact that I want you to carry into the viewing experience is about the casting of the two leads, and specifically the timing of it. Park Eun-bin was reportedly cast as the female lead Eun Chae-ni in April 2024, and Cha Eun-woo joined the project as the male lead Lee Won-jung a few months later in July 2024. That gap between their castings is interesting because it tells you something about the creative process. Chae-ni was clearly the anchor character from whom the whole story was built, and the show was designed around Park Eun-bin's strengths first. Park Eun-bin, for those unfamiliar with her work, is one of the most decorated performers of her generation in Korean television. Her ability to play intellectually unconventional, socially awkward, deeply lovable characters is something she has refined to something close to an art form, particularly after her star-making performance in Extraordinary Attorney Woo. But here's what makes Tiny different from that earlier role in ways that matter. Chae-ni is not someone who processes the world through a different kind of intelligence. Chae-ni processes the world through sheer unstoppable life force. She's chaotic, she's warm, she's the kind of person who creates disasters and then charms her way through the aftermath. That is a different kind of performance, and Park Hyun-bin's commitment to it is something we'll come back to in detail. Now, let's step inside the box. The Wonderfuls is a 2026 South Korean limited series streaming exclusively on Netflix, released on May 15th of this year. It runs 8 episodes and is the work of director Yoo In-sik, creator Kang Gu-ong, and writer Heo Da-jong. The series is set in 1999, the final year of the millennium, in a fictional South Korean city called Haeseong. It stars Park Eun-bin, Cha Eun-woo, Kim Hae-suk, Choi Dae-hoon, Im Seong-jae, and Song-jo in a superhero action comedy about a group of ordinary, deeply imperfect townspeople who accidentally gain superpowers and then proceed to use those powers with a level of competence that could most generously be described as developing. The genre is superhero comedy action adventure, which on paper sounds like a very crowded space. But here's where the show immediately earns its place. It is not trying to be an ironic deconstruction of superhero tropes in the way that so much Western content has gone. It isn't trying to be dark or gritty or subversive, it is trying very sincerely to be warm, funny, and genuinely moving. And that sincerity, that refusal to wink at the camera and distance itself from its own emotional stakes, is what makes it land so hard for so many viewers. At its heart, this is a story about people who are given something extraordinary and still feel like they don't deserve it. It's about community. the kind that exists in a specific city, among people who have known each other their whole lives and drive each other crazy because of exactly that. And it's set against the backdrop of the Y2K scare, that period in human history when the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for a technological apocalypse that never came, which gives the show a very specific and very effective emotional texture. The world is already feeling like it might end. And then these people get superpowers on top of everything else. Should you watch the show? Yes. Clearly and genuinely, yes. If you enjoy Korean dramas, superhero stories with real human warmth, ensemble comedy that actually earns its laugh out loud moments, and a sense of nostalgia for a specific kind of late 90s world that the show recreates with extraordinary attention to detail, this is made for you. If you're someone who came to Korean drama through extraordinary attorney Woo and loves Park Eun-bin's particular brand of performing, this is absolutely made for you, even though Chae-ni is a completely different kind of character. And if you've never watched a Korean superhero show before, honestly, this might be the best entry point that exists right now. The show is welcoming, it wants you to have a good time, but it also wants you to feel something real, and it delivers on both. My personal rating is 7.4 out of 10, which means I think this is genuinely good television. Not flawless, and we will get into the specific places where it stumbles, because I think those gaps are actually worth understanding if you want to appreciate what the show is attempting. But 7.4 means this worked on me. It made me laugh out loud more than once. It made me care about people I hadn't expected to care about. And it left me with something that stayed longer than I thought it would. That is a meaningful score. And by the time we get to the end of this breakdown, I think you'll understand exactly why it sits where it does. But before we get into the detailed story walkthrough, let me tell you what it actually felt like to sit down with this show for the first time. Because that first watch experience is something I think is worth documenting honestly, especially for anyone who might be on the fence about starting it. I am into the Wonderfools with a specific set of expectations. I knew the premise, I knew the creative team. I was expecting something fun, warm, and professionally competent, which, given the people involved, felt like a reasonable baseline assumption. What I was less prepared for was the specific energy the show opens with. The first episode drops you into Haeseong City in 1999 with a confidence and a specificity that immediately signals this is a world these filmmakers actually love. The production design in those early scenes is extraordinary in a subtle way. The clothing, the storefronts, the technology, the way people talk about Y2K as though it is a real and immediate threat to their daily life, all of it creates a texture that feels genuine rather than performed. This isn't nostalgia as wallpaper. This is 1999 as a living, breathing, slightly anxious world. And then we meet Eun Chae-ni. And here's the thing, I was not prepared for how immediately and completely Park Eun-bin would take over. Within the first few minutes of screen time, Chae-ni is already a fully formed disaster. She's late. She's knocking things over. She's managing approximately 7 problems at once with the cheerful energy of someone who has long since made peace with the fact that her life will always contain 7 simultaneous problems. And yet, and this is the essential thing, she is never pathetic. She is never someone you feel sorry for. She is someone you want to follow everywhere she goes because wherever she goes, something is about to happen, and whatever happens, she is going to meet it with a kind of stubborn, warm hearted refusal to be defeated that is impossible not to admire. I walked in expecting a fun ensemble comedy. The show gave me that, and then it gave me a character I genuinely fell for about 20 minutes in. That is a good opening. That is a really good opening. The atmosphere the show creates in those first 10 minutes is something worth dwelling on for a moment because it matters to everything that follows. There is something very specific about a story set at the end of an era, and the Wonderful uses that setting with more intention than it might initially appear. The year 1999 in this show is not just a backdrop, it is an emotional state. The whole world is waiting for something catastrophic to happen, and in the absence of it actually happening, ordinary life has taken on a kind of heightened quality. Every mundane moment feels slightly charged because everyone is carrying the unspoken awareness that everything might be about to change. That psychological state of living in the last days of something without knowing what comes next is exactly the emotional context this show needs for its characters. Because what the Wonderfuls experience when they gain their powers is not joy, not at first. What they experience is something very close to what everyone around them is experiencing because of Y2K, the terrifying, exhilarating, unmanageable feeling that the world has suddenly become a place where the rules don't apply the way they used to. The period setting and the superhero premise are doing the same emotional work, and that is not an accident. What hooked me in the first 10 minutes beyond Park Eun-bin's performance was a particular scene in the opening episode that I want to describe without spoiling the specifics, because it is better experienced fresh. There is a moment very early on where Chinny tries to do something completely ordinary, something so small it barely registers as a story event, and it goes wrong in a way that has consequences none of the characters could have predicted. The way the scene is shot, the way it's paced, the way the music lands underneath it, it was the moment I understood what kind of show this was going to be. It isn't a show where chaos happens to people from the outside. It's a show where the chaos is in the people themselves. It has always been there, and the superpowers don't create it. They just make it visible. That is a beautiful and very smart thematic foundation, and it's established in the first 10 minutes. That's when I knew I was in. Now, let's go inside. Let's open this completely. Let's walk through what actually happens in this story, and I want to bring you into it so you feel it the way I felt it watching. Not just a sequence of events, but a world with real weight and real people inside it. Here's the full story walkthrough of the Wonderfools. Haeseong City is a kind of small Korean city that has its own specific gravity. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone has a history with everyone. And in 1999, with the millennium countdown visible on every television screen and in every anxious conversation, the city is also carrying a quieter local anxiety. A string of unexplained disappearances that nobody seems to have a satisfying answer for. People are going missing, not dramatically, not with obvious signs of violence, just gone. And the local authorities, overwhelmed and underpowered, are treating it as a series of unrelated incidents rather than a pattern. Into this world, we meet Eun Chae-ni, Park Eun-bin's tour de force of cheerful catastrophe. Jenny is not a person who exists at the margins of Haeseong. She is woven into its fabric in the way that only someone born and raised there can be. She knows the streets, the people, the rhythms of the place with the intimate familiarity of someone who has never needed to think about them consciously. She lives with her grandmother Kim Jeon-bok, played by the formidable Kim Hae-suk, a woman who runs one of the city's best-loved restaurants and who carries herself with the kind of authority that only comes from a life fully and independently lived. Their relationship is one of the most quietly lovely things the show offers. There is a shorthand between them, a combination of deep love and mutual exasperation that feels more like something overheard in real life than something constructed for dramatic purposes. Yeonbok clearly worries about her granddaughter. Just as clearly, she is also deeply proud of her in a way she would never say directly. That emotional undertow in their scenes together rewards close attention. Chenye's immediate world also includes Son Kyung-hoon, played by Choi Da-hoon, with a perfectly calibrated combination of pomposity and fragility, who occupies the role of Haeseong City Hall's most dedicated complainer. Kyung-hoon is not a bad person. He is precisely the kind of person who would explain at considerable length why he is not a bad person. He has opinions about everything, particularly anything that could be described as an official regulation or an infringement of his rights as a citizen, and he has never once in his life passed up an opportunity to formally register those opinions with whatever authority figure is available. Why Dae-hoon plays him with a specificity that means you recognize this person immediately. You have met this person, everyone has met this person, and that recognition is what makes his later uplands so effectively. We'll get to that. The other person in Chae-ni's immediate sphere is Kang Ro-bin, played by Im Song-jae, who is essentially the human embodiment of the word pushover. Robin cannot say no to anything. He cannot assert himself in any situation. He is the person everyone in the city has come to rely on for exactly this quality. If you need someone to do something inconvenient, Robin will do it. Not because he wants to, but because the social mechanics of declining are simply too complicated for him to manage. Im Seong-jae plays this with a sweetness that prevents it from ever becoming one note. There is a dignity to Robin's endless accommodation, a sense that at some level this is a person who genuinely loves taking care of people, even if he doesn't know how to reclaim that truth for himself. And then there is the person who arrives from outside. Lee Woon-jung. Chao Eun-woo is not from Haeseong. He is a civic servant dispatched from Seoul with a very particular brief to investigate the disappearances that the local authorities have failed to resolve. Is on the surface a character type that Korean drama audiences will recognize instantly. The handsome, rule obsessed, emotionally constipated official who processes the world through procedure because procedure is safer than feeling. But here's what's interesting about Boon Jung, and here's what makes Cha Eun-woo's performance worth watching closely. The character's rigidity is not presented as something to be comedically dismantled and replaced with warmth. It's presented as a genuine and somewhat earned response to a life that has taught him that improvisation leads to pain. The show is interested in why Woon Jung is the way he is, not just in the entertainment value of watching someone stiff eventually loosen up. That distinction matters to the emotional architecture of everything that follows. Woon Jung arrives in Haeseong with five protocols and exactly zero intention of becoming personally involved in anything. He has a theory about the disappearances. He has a method. He has a timeline. And then he meets Chae-ni, and the timeline evaporates. The method gets complicated in ways his protocols do not cover, and the theory, while not entirely wrong, turns out to be missing several crucial layers that only Chae-ni's chaotic intimacy with the city could have revealed. Their dynamic is established in the first scene together with enormous efficiency. Chae-ni treats Woon Jung the way she treats every obstacle in her life, which is to say as something to be moved around or through with cheerful disregard for its preferred response. Woon Jung treats Chae-ni the way he treats every irregularity in his protocols, which is to say as something that should not exist and yet inconveniently does. The comedy writes itself. But crucially, and this is what separates good romantic comedy construction from lazy romantic comedy construction, the show never lets their mutual irritation stay simple. From very early on, there are moments between them where the friction isn't just inconvenience, but something closer to recognition. Two people who are each, in their different ways, operating outside the normal social drama of the people around them, and who therefore recognize in each other something that doesn't quite fit anywhere else either. The inciting event, the moment the box begins to open, occurs in an incident that is simultaneously absurd and deeply important to everything that follows. Chae-ni is involved in a situation that she did not cause in any direct sense but was nonetheless absolutely characteristically unavoidably present for, and during this incident something happens. Something that cannot be explained by the rules of the world as she has always understood them. Something that leaves Jenny with an ability she did not ask for, cannot control, and initially cannot even accurately describe. The show is deliberately careful about the mechanics here. The powers don't arrive with instruction manuals. They arrive the way most significant life changes arrive, which is in the middle of something else entirely, with no preparation and no immediately obvious framework for understanding what they mean. The ripple effect of this incident spreads outward almost immediately. Kyung-hoon is nearby, Robin is nearby, and both of them, through a chain of cause and effect that is funnier to watch than it is to describe, end up connected to whatever phenomenon touched Chae-ni first. Within the first two episodes, you have three people in Haeseong City who are in possession of superhuman abilities, none of whom has any idea how to use them, all of whom are trying to manage this new reality while simultaneously managing their existing lives in a city that is already anxious about the world ending. The tonal brilliance of the show is in how it holds those two things together. The comedy of complete incompetence and the genuine existential weight of suddenly being different from everyone around you in a way you can't explain or control. What makes this different from the standard superhero origin story template is the granularity of the ordinary life that the powers disrupt. These aren't people with clean emotional slates who happen to get powers and then make clean heroic choices. Kyung-hoon still has a city council complaint he needs to file. Robin still cannot figure out how to cancel plans with someone who makes him feel guilty. Chae-ni still has her grandmother's restaurant to help run and approximately six other responsibilities she is already failing to adequately address. The superpowers land on top of an existing mess of obligations, relationships, and personal inadequacies. And the result is that the show is never just a superhero show. It's a show about people who are already struggling to manage being themselves, for whom the powers are simply one more overwhelming development in a life that was already full of overwhelming development. That is genuine insight into how people actually experience transformative change, and it gives the comedy a real underpinning of truth. Meanwhile, Won Jun's investigation into the disappearances is beginning to uncover something that his protocols were not designed to handle. The pattern in the missing persons cases is not random. There is a logic to it, a selection, a method that points towards something deliberate. And the closer Won Jong gets to the center of it, the more the lines between his official investigation and Chinese, entirely unofficial and increasingly superpowered chaos begin to overlap. There is a specific moment in the middle stretch of the show where these two storylines, the investigation and the accidental heroes, click together in a way that recontextualizes everything that came before it. It's the moment the show reveals that what looked like coincidence was actually architecture. And I want to stop here, just before the full depth of that reveal, because this is where the spoiler section needs to live. But before we get there, let's step back and talk about what this show does brilliantly. Because there is a lot. And I think being specific about it matters because I want you to understand not just that it's good, but why it's good, and how it's good, and what the people involved did to make it that way. Park Eun-bin commands the screen the way certain performers command a stage, not through dominance but through a kind of gravitational pull that makes it almost physically difficult to look anywhere else when she is present in a scene. But let's not generalize, let's be specific. Because generalization is easy and specificity is where the real understanding lies. There is a scene in the second episode of The Wonderfools that I have thought about more than almost any other single moment in the show, and it is not one of the big action beats or the emotional high points that the promotional material would lead you to expect. It is a small scene, a quiet one. Jenny is in her grandmother's restaurant after something has happened that she cannot explain to anyone. She doesn't have the language for it yet. And even if she did, who would believe her? And she is doing the one thing she always does when she doesn't know what else to do, which is work. She's cleaning tables, she's checking on customers. She's doing the 10,000 small physical acts that make up the maintenance of a space that someone loves. And Park Eun-bin plays this scene with almost no dialogue, with almost no obvious emotional performance in the traditional sense. And yet you can feel every single thing going on inside Jenny. The confusion, the fear she won't name as fear, the stubborn insistence on normal life as an anchor, through nothing more than the specific quality of attention she brings to each small task. That is not a scene that a lesser performer could have carried. That is a scene that requires someone who understands that the body tells the story the mouth refuses to tell. Park Eun-bin understands that. She understands it in her bones. And The Wonderfools is built around that understanding in a way that is, I think, the single most important casting decision the production made. Cha Eun-woo's performance as Won Jong is a more contested achievement. And I want to be honest about that because I think it's worth unpacking carefully. There are viewers and critics who found his work here limited, and I understand that response. Woon-young's emotional restraint means that Chao Eun-woo spends a significant portion of the show in a register of performance that doesn't allow for the kind of obvious, expressive work that earns immediate recognition. He is not going to give you a breakdown scene in episode 3. He is not going to suddenly transform into a different person because of love or crisis or revelation. What he does instead is something slower and quieter and, I would argue, significantly harder. He builds a character from the inside out, in increments so small that you only realize how much has shifted when you look back at where Woon Jung was in episode 1 and compare it to where he is in episode 7. The change is seismic, but it accumulates the way real change accumulates, not in a single dramatic moment, but through 100 small adjustments to posture, to timing, to the specific quality of eye contact, to whether the hands are clasped or open. Chao Eun-woo has been criticized throughout his career for a certain emotional flatness in performance, and I have read those critics and found them partially valid in other contexts. Here I think the flatness is the performance, and I think it works. Whether you agree will probably depend on your patience for a particular kind of restraint. But I would ask you to watch the scene in episode 6 where Woon Jung finally articulates something he has been carrying since the beginning of the show, not through a speech, not through tears, but through a single small action he takes without explanation. And then tell me that the work was surface level. I don't think you'll be able to. Kim Hae-sok as Kim Jun-bok deserves her own extended conversation because she does something in this show that I find genuinely remarkable. She plays a character who is fundamentally mysterious, the grandmother with a glamorous and dark past that the show teases and reveals in careful increments, while simultaneously playing a character who is immediate and warm and pleasant in every scene she occupies. That combination is extremely difficult. Mystery usually requires withholding. Warmth usually requires openness. Yeon-bok is both at the same time in every scene, and Kim Hae-suk makes it look completely effortless. There is a moment in episode 4, and I'm staying deliberately vague because this is pre-spoiler territory, where something is revealed about Jeon-bok's past that reconfigures the entire emotional landscape of her relationship with Jenny. It is not a dramatic plot revelation in the traditional sense. It doesn't come with swelling music or a confrontation. It arrives quietly, almost casually, in the middle of what looks like an ordinary domestic scene. And the reason it hits so hard is because Kim Hae-suk has been playing the full weight of that secret in every prior scene without ever letting you see the seams. That is masterclass acting. That is the kind of performance that makes you want to go back and re-watch everything she was in before this. Because you know now that you were probably missing layers you didn't know to look for. Hwai Dae-hoon as Kyung-hoon is, for my money, the funniest person in the show. And I say that as someone who thinks Park Eun-bin is extraordinary. But there is a specific kind of comedy that Choi Dae-won does here that is almost impossible to describe and deeply pleasurable to experience. The comedy of a person who is absolutely certain of their own correctness in all situations while being demonstrably, hilariously incorrect in most of them. The thing that prevents this from becoming a simple buffoon character, and this is entirely down to Choi Dae-hoon's craft, is that Kyung-hoon's wrongness always comes from a place of genuine principle. He is not stupid, he is not malicious. He has simply constructed a world view in which the rules exist to protect people like him, and any deviation from the rules is therefore a personal affront to be formally protested. And when the superpowers arrive and the rules stop applying to his own body, the cognitive dissonance is extraordinary to watch. Choi Dae-won plays the specific comedy of a principled man being betrayed by his own flesh with a commitment and a specificity that had me laughing out loud in ways I didn't fully understand until I thought about them afterward. There is a particular recurring bit in episodes 3 and 4 involving Kyung-hoon's relationship with his newly acquired ability. I won't specify what the ability is that builds and builds over multiple scenes until it pays off in a single, perfectly timed moment that is among the funniest things I have seen in Korean drama in years. The patience of that construction is a credit to both the lighting and to Choi Tae-hoon's commitment to not playing the joke early. Im Song-jae's as Eun-bin occupies a different register entirely, and the show is wise enough to give him space to play it. Where Kyung-hoon's comedy is about collision principle meeting the absurdity of circumstance, Eun-bin's comedy is about absence, about all the space where a self-assurance should be but isn't. Im Seung-jae plays Eun-bin with a gentleness that could dip into tedium in lesser hands, but instead becomes something quietly devastating as the show progresses. Because Robin's inability to say no is not just a personality quirk. It's the symptom of something the show takes seriously, which is the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent so long managing other people's comfort that they have completely lost track of their own. And when his superpowers arrive, and they are characteristically the kind of power that means other people can impose their will on him even more easily than before. The comic despair of that situation is matched by a real emotional resonance that snuck up on me entirely. Im Seong-jae earns a moment in episode 5 that is played completely straight, with no comedy at all, and it is one of the most unexpectedly affecting things the show offers. I did not see it coming. And that is partly because he had been so consistently positioned as the source of gentle comedy that the gear shift, when it came, hit with a force the show had been quietly loading from the beginning. Son In-joo as Ha-won-do is the show's antagonist, and I want to be careful here because the specifics of his character belong more properly in the spoiler section. But in terms of performance, what Son In-joo does with this role is something I want to acknowledge in this pre-spoiler space. He plays a character who is terrifying not because of what he does, but because of the specific quality of his stillness. Ha-won-do is not a ranter, nor a physical presence that overwhelms a room through size or aggression. He is a person whose danger lives entirely in the gap between what he expresses and what you sense he is capable of. That gap is Son Hyun-joo's performance. Every scene he is in, you are watching a performance of reasonableness that you cannot quite trust, and the specific way your body registers that untrustworthiness before your mind has articulated why, that is the work. Son Hyun-joo has played this kind of character before in his career, but never quite with this particular combination of warmth and wrongness. It is a very precise and very disciplined performance, and it enriches every scene it touches. Now let's talk about the story construction itself, because the Wonderfools make several structural choices that are worth examining closely, both the choices that work brilliantly and the ones that carry some cost. Let me start with what it gets exactly right. The show understands something fundamental about ensemble storytelling that many productions with larger casts get wrong. It understands that the ensemble is only as strong as the individual relationships within it, and that those individual relationships need to be established with their own specific emotional logic before they can do any work in the larger group dynamic. The Wonderfools is extremely patient about this. In its first 2 episodes, it takes its time introducing each character not just as a collection of traits, but as a set of specific, active desires and fears. We know what Chae-ni wants. She wants to hold her world together, to be enough for the people who depend on her, to be someone her grandmother can be proud of. We know what Kyung-hoon fears. Invisibility, the sense that his careful, rule-governed life might not matter as much as he has always insisted it does. We know what Robin is quietly desperate for. Permission from someone, anyone, to put himself first just once without the sky falling. We know what Woon-jung is protecting. A version of himself that can function without needing anything from anyone, which is the version he built after something took from him the luxury of needing. By the time the powers alive and these 4 people are thrown into a situation they cannot manage separately, the audience has all the emotional information needed to understand why each of them responds the way they do. That preparation is what makes the ensemble feel alive rather than convenient. The show did the work, and when the work is done properly in the setup, the payoff lands with a weight that feels earned rather than manufactured. The structural architecture of the 8 episodes is also more deliberate than it initially appears. The show opens with what feels like a fairly wide frame, Haeseong City, its rhythms, its characters, the texture of 1999, and then, over the course of the first 3 episodes, it systematically tightens the focus until by episode 4, you are operating in an almost claustrophobically intimate world where the space between these specific people and their specific problems is the whole universe. That tightening is controlled and purposeful. The show knows exactly how much context it needs to establish before it can afford to narrow its lens, and it never narrows too soon. Then, from episode 4 onward, it begins to widen again, but widen now by the stakes of the investigation, by the revelation of the threat that Woon-jung has been tracking, by the growing sense that what is happening in Haesong is not isolated or accidental. The widening happens at the right moment, when the emotional investment in the characters is deep enough that the expansion of the world's stakes feels personal rather than abstract. You're not watching a plot unfold. You're watching people you care about navigate a world that keeps getting bigger and more dangerous around them. That is exactly how you want an 8 episode limited series to work. The show's handling of the comedy and the drama, specifically the way it manages their coexistence without letting one undermine the other, is also worth singling out as a genuine achievement. Korean drama has a long tradition of what is sometimes called the tonal shift, the moment in an otherwise light show where genuine darkness arrives and is expected to coexist with everything that came before. Sometimes this works. Frequently it does not, and the darkness feels grafted on, a formal obligation rather than an organic development. In the Wonderfools, the tonal complexity is integrated rather than superimposed. The comedy and the drama are never separate modes. They are always happening at the same time because the characters are always simultaneously funny and sad. Jen is funny because she is chaotic. She is sad because the chaos is how she manages not to be still long enough to feel how much she is carrying. Kyung-woon is funny because he complains about everything. He is sad because the complaining is the only way he knows how to ask for attention. These things are not in opposition. They are two expressions of the same emotional truth, and the show, to its credit, always treats them as such. There is a specific episode, episode 5, which I think is the strongest single episode of the series, where the comedy and the drama are woven so tightly together that you find yourself laughing and then immediately, almost physically, struck by the emotional weight underneath the laugh. The structure of that episode is almost musical. It sets up a comedic situation with real stakes, plays the comedy with full commitment, and then in the final sequence reveals the emotional cost of what just happened in a way that recontextualizes the comedy you were just laughing at as something closer to tragedy. Not tragic comedy in the bleak, self conscious sense, but comedy that, when you look at it closely, reveals how much it costs a person to keep performing cheerfulness in the face of genuine difficulty. Park Eun-bin is doing extraordinary things in that episode, and she's doing them with almost no help from the script. The writing sets it up, but it's her specific performance choices that land the emotional weight. The scene I'm thinking of specifically, I will describe in the spoiler section, but I want you to know it's there and that it will stay with you. Now let's talk about the direction, because Eun-sik does something in the Wonderfools that I think is more sophisticated than the show's genre positioning might lead you to expect. The superhero action sequences are competent and fun. They are exactly what they need to be, staged with enough clarity that you understand the spatial relationships and the specific nature of each power, and executed with a lightness of touch that keeps them from ever feeling self-importantly spectacular. But the direction's real achievement is not in the action, it's in the ordinary scenes. Yoo In-sik has a specific gift for the geography of emotional space. The way he positions characters relative to each other within a frame tells you about their relationship in ways that no dialogue could articulate with the same efficiency. Two people standing at the same distance from each other in episode 1 means something completely different by episode 5, because the director has been systematically adjusting that distance throughout the series in ways you feel subconsciously before you can name them. The scene where Woon Jung and Jae-ni are first in the same room together is shot with a very deliberate amount of negative space between them. The camera doesn't close that space, doesn't try to manufacture intimacy through proximity. It shows you the gap, and it trusts you to understand that the gap is a story. By the time that gap begins to close in the middle episodes, it has accumulated so much meaning that the physical adjustment of the camera feels like a declaration. There are also specific visual choices in the show's 1999 setting that deserve attention because they represent a directorial intelligence about period that goes beyond simple recreation. The color palette of the show shifts subtly from episode to episode in a way that is never commented on in the dialogue, but that creates an emotional temperature gradient across the series. The early episodes are warm, amber, low contrast light, the quality of late afternoon in a specific kind of Korean city in a specific kind of era. As the series progresses and the threat becomes clearer and the stakes increase, the palette cools. Not dramatically, not in the heavy handed way of a production that wants you to notice its cinematography, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, in the way actual weather changes. By episode 6, you are watching a world that feels slightly colder than the one you entered in episode 1, and that temperature change reflects the emotional journey of the characters exactly. It's a quiet, disciplined use of visual glamour, and it's exactly the kind of detail that separates a show that is competently made from a show that is made with genuine artistic intention. The production design of the 1999 setting is something I want to linger on for a moment because it is doing more work than it might initially appear. Haeseong City in 1999 is not a monument to nostalgia. It is not trying to make you feel warm and fuzzy about the late 90s in a generic way. It is instead trying to recreate a specific emotional reality about what life in that era actually felt like. The weight of analog systems, the specific friction of a world without instant information, the way community functioned differently when you couldn't disappear into a screen when a conversation became uncomfortable. The lack of smartphones is not just a period detail, it is a structural element of the story. Every time these characters need to find each other, or warn each other, or coordinate their hopelessly incompetent superhero activities, they have to do it through the physical mechanics of a world before connectivity. They have to show up in person, they have to leave notes, they have to trust that the other person will be where they said they would be. And there is a specific kind of intimacy that grows out of that. A reliance on presence rather than information, on relationship rather than communication, that the show uses beautifully. The setting is not decoration. It is a machine for producing a specific kind of human connection, and the show knows it. The music in The Wonderfools is another component worth discussing with genuine attention because it is more sophisticated than the show's genre might lead you to anticipate. The score moves between two very different registers, an electronic, slightly retro-futuristic sound that mounts the superhero elements, drawing on the sonic textures of late 90s electronic music to create something that feels both period-appropriate and genre-aware, and a much simpler, more intimate acoustic palette that governs the human moments, the scenes between Chae-ni and her grandmother, the quiet personal confessions and revelations. The contrast between these two musical worlds is itself an argument the show is making about the difference between the spectacular version of what is happening to these characters and the private version, the difference between being a person with powers and being a person. The music never lets you forget that these two things are simultaneous and separate, and that distinction is one of the show's most consistent and most resonant things. There is one scene in The Wonderfools that is, for me, completely and definitively unforgettable, and I'm going to describe it carefully here, staying on the right side of the spoiler line, because I think the unforgettability of it can be communicated without giving away the specific narrative content. It is a nighttime scene. It involves two characters who have been at odds with each other for most of the series, and it takes place in a location that has accumulated considerable meaning over the preceding episodes. A location that started as somewhere ordinary and has become, through the accumulation of scenes and choices and small moments, somewhere charged with significance. One character says something to the other that is not on the surface an emotionally significant statement. It is a practical observation, a logistical point about what needs to happen next. But the context around it, what both characters know about themselves and each other at this point in the story, what has just happened, what is about to happen, transforms this logistical observation into something that sounds like a declaration. And the camera holds on both of their faces, not cutting away, not rushing to the next line of dialogue, just holding for long enough that you understand that the scene is asking you to sit with what just happened rather than moving past it. That kind of patience, that willingness to trust the audience's attention and emotional intelligence, is the mark of a production that believes in its own material. And in that moment, I believed in it completely. Now let's be honest about where the show falls short, because 7.4 out of 10 is a real score with real meaning, and the 2.6 that isn't there represents genuine gaps in the experience that I think are worth naming specifically. Not to be harsh, but because understanding where a show doesn't quite reach helps you appreciate more clearly what it is actually doing and what it is attempting. The most significant structural issue in The Wonderfools is the pacing of its middle section, specifically episodes 3 and 4, which, when I'm being direct about it, sag. Not collapse, not fail, but sag. The show establishes its world and its characters with enormous confidence and energy in episodes 1 and 2, and it pays off in episode 5 with the sequence I described earlier as the strongest single episode. But in between, it is doing the necessary work of building toward that payoff. And that work is not always as compelling to watch as the setup or the release. Episodes 3 and 4 contain some of the most important narrative and thematic groundwork of the entire series. The investigation deepens, certain character relationships shift, the shape of the threat begins to clarify, but the episode level pacing in this stretch lacks the forward momentum of what precedes and follows it. There are scenes that run longer than the material strictly justifies, conversations that cover ground the audience has already emotionally processed, and a particular subplot in episode 3 involving Kyung-hoon's professional life at City Hall that, while individually entertaining, feels like it exists to fill time rather than advance anything. It is the kind of structural problem that usually occurs when a production has made the right macro choices. Right character work, right thematic architecture, right tonal balance, but has not been quite ruthless enough in the editing room about micro-pacing. The show would be tighter and more propulsive if 10 minutes were trimmed across those two middle episodes. It would also be 10 minutes less charming in places, which is the cost of that trimming, and I understand why the edit went the way it did. But the sag is real, and it is worth flagging for anyone who might otherwise have assumed a pacing issue when the show wasn't for them. Push through. What's on the other side of episode 4 is worth the patience the middle section asks you to extend. The second area where the show falls measurably short is in the development of its secondary antagonist, a character who appears in the middle episodes as what initially seems to be a significant threat, and who then exits the story in episode 5 in a way that feels abrupt and underwritten relative to the establishment they were given. I am being deliberately vague about these characters' identity and the specifics of their arc because naming them too precisely would constitute a mild spoiler, but I want to acknowledge the gap because it is genuinely present and it represents a missed narrative opportunity. The character in question was positioned in the story in a way that suggested the show was building toward a confrontation that would have meaningful personal stakes for at least two of the main ensemble members. That confrontation, when it comes, is truncated, resolved with a speed and a neatness that feels inconsistent with the care the show took to establish the emotional stakes involved. Whether this was a scripting decision, a production decision made during the editing process, or a function of the 8-episode format that forced certain elements to be compressed, I don't know. But the effect is the noticeable unevenness in the midsection of the show's antagonist architecture. A gap between what was promised and what was delivered that the story never quite feels. The third issue, and this is a slightly different kind of critique, is about the way the show handles a specific category of its action sequences, specifically the group sequences in which all four of the powered characters are operating simultaneously. The individual power demonstrations in the series are uniformly well executed. Each character's ability is coherent, distinguishable, and staged with enough visual clarity that the comedy of its misuse is always legible. But when all four characters are in the same action sequence at the same time, the direction occasionally loses the clarity maintained so well in the smaller sequences. There are two or three moments across the series where you are watching something technically impressive and visually busy, and you are not quite sure what just happened to which person or how the tactical situation has changed. This is a specific directorial challenge in ensemble action storytelling. How do you maintain both the comedy and the spatial clarity when you have four different people doing four different physically extraordinary things in the same location? The Wonderful solves this problem beautifully in its best action sequences, but not consistently. And when the clarity goes, the comedy goes with it, because the comedy of incompetent superpowers depends entirely on your being able to see exactly what went wrong and whose fault it was. There is also a more structural concern worth raising about the romantic storyline, specifically the show's handling of the central relationship between Chinny and Woon-jung in the second half of the series. This is a delicate critique because, as I have already said, I think the performances in this storyline are excellent. Park Eun-bin and Eun-woo build something real and specific between them across the course of the series. But the script's handling of the romantic development in episodes 6 and 7 occasionally lapses into genre convention in ways that feel slightly at odds with the specificity and originality the show demonstrated in its setup. There are a couple of scenes in this stretch that deploy recognizable key drama romantic beats, specific configurations of emotional near miss and dramatic misunderstanding in a way that feels slightly mechanical compared to the freshness of the earlier episodes. It is not that these scenes are bad, they are well performed and they serve their narrative function, but they feel in places like the show reaching for a well worn map when it had been navigating so confidently by its own sense of direction. The relationship still works, but it works slightly less specifically in those moments, and the show had earned enough credit by that point that the gear shift was noticeable. A finer, smaller concern, the show's treatment of certain background characters in Haeseong City. The neighbors, the regulars at John Box restaurant, the peripheral figures of the community, is warm and generally well handled. But there are moments where these characters function more as comic backdrop than as actual people. The show's central ensemble is drawn with such specificity and care that the contrast with the slightly thinner background characterization is occasionally visible in a way it might not be in a less carefully constructed show. This is a minor issue in the overall balance of the series, but it is one that a subsequent season, if the show is extended, which according to early reporting has not yet been announced, could profitably address by deepening the world of Haesong beyond its central six characters. But here is the thing about all of these criticisms, and here is why I want to be precise in laying them out rather than simply gesturing at them. None of them actually hurt the show's core experience in a way that matters to whether you should watch it. The pacing sag in the middle is real but navigable. The underwritten secondary antagonist is a genuine missed opportunity, but not a structural wound. The occasional loss of action clarity is frustrating but infrequent, and the romantic conventionality in episodes 6 and 7 is a minor regression in a relationship that is otherwise built with real intelligence and care. What these flaws tell you collectively is that The Wonderfools is a show that aimed very high and cleared most of the bar, but not every inch of it. 7.4 out of 10 is the honest accounting of that achievement. It is genuinely good television, made with real artistry and real heart, operating in a genre that often sacrifices both of those things in favor of spectacle. The fact that it occasionally stumbles doesn't change what it is or what it achieves. A 7.4 is not a consolation prize, it is a real endorsement. This show deserves its audience. Now, before we move into the full spoiler breakdown, let's take a step back and think about what world the Wonderfuls arrived into, because that context shapes how we should understand the show's ambitions and whether it achieves them. And there is a lot to say here that I think enriches the viewing experience significantly. The Wonderful landed on Netflix on May 15, 2026, and it arrived into a very specific moment in the K-drama landscape, one defined by both the extraordinary global success of Korean content over the past several years and by a growing conversation among both critics and audiences about whether that success has created a creative pressure to produce at a scale and pace that doesn't always serve the actual quality of the storytelling. Korean drama has, over the past decade, developed a global audience that was largely built on the shoulders of a relatively small number of extraordinary individual works. Squid Game, Extraordinary Attorney Woo, Parasite in film, and before those, decades of slower international discovery. And with that global audience has come a global commercial expectation that not every production can meet. The Wonderful occupies an interesting position in this landscape because it is simultaneously a response to that commercial expectation. It has the production value, the Netflix global platform, the star casting that signals commercial ambition, and a work that seems, in its creative heart, much less interested in international spectacle than in the specific, intimate, locally rooted story it wants to tell. It is a globally positioned show that is fundamentally, at its emotional core, a very Korean story. And that tension between the global rapper and the local soul is something worth sitting with as a viewer. The critical reception to the Wonderfuls upon release has been, by any measure, strong. The show sits at 100% positive on critical aggregator sites at the time of writing, though it should be noted that the critical sample size is still relatively small. 5 critics reviewed for those initial aggregate scores, which means the percentage carries less statistical weight than it might appear to at first glance. The more meaningful critical signal is in the consistent pattern of what critics placed. Virtually every review, regardless of the outlet or the specific critical perspective, singled out the warmth of the show's humanism, the quality of the ensemble performance, and the skill with which it handles its 1999 setting as things it does genuinely well. The critical consensus is not just positive. In a vague, everything is fine sense, it is specific in its praise, which is a better indicator of genuine quality than a unanimous positive verdict built on soft enthusiasm. Audience reception has been, if anything, more enthusiastic than the critical response, and the specific nature of that enthusiasm is interesting. The show appears to have developed a particularly passionate international fan base very quickly, accelerated it seems by the combination of Park Eun-bin's existing global audience from Extraordinary Attorney Woo and Chao Eun-woo's substantial fan base from his K-pop career with the group Astro as well as his previous drama work. But what's notable about the audience conversation around the Wonderfuls is that it isn't simply fan enthusiasm for the stars, it's genuine engagement with the show's themes, specific praise for character moments, and the kind of rewatch culture that tends to develop around shows that reward close attention. People are going back. They are finding things they missed. They are discussing specific scenes and specific performances with the kind of specificity that indicates genuine investment rather than parasocial enthusiasm for the cast members. That is a good sign for any show's longevity. What I find particularly interesting about the show in its cultural moment is the timing of its Y2K setting. We are now far enough removed from 1999 that it occupies a very specific space in cultural memory. Not quite old enough to be pure history, not recent enough to be immediately personal for the show's younger international viewers, but close enough that for the generation now in their late 30s and 40s who lived through it, the recreation of that era carries genuine emotional resonance. The Y2K anxiety that the show recreates is not simply a period quirk. It was a real cultural experience, the specific existential discomfort of a global countdown to a possibly catastrophic unknown, and the show treats it with enough seriousness that viewers who remember it will recognize the emotional texture as authentic. At the same time, for younger viewers discovering this era for the first time through the show, there is something almost fascinatingly alien about a world that was genuinely afraid of something that ultimately didn't happen. The show functions differently for these two audiences, but it functions well for both, which is a significant creative achievement. There is also something worth noting about the show's superhero genre positioning in its specific cultural moment, because the Wonderfools arrived at a time when both Hollywood superhero fatigue and the global appetite for superhero content outside the Hollywood model are simultaneously very real phenomena. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, after a period of extraordinary dominance, has spent the last several years navigating a more complicated relationship with its audience, a relationship in which genuine enthusiasm and genuine fatigue coexist, and in which the appetite for spectacle has noticeably cooled in favor of something with more emotional specificity. The Wonderfuls is a superhero show that has almost no interest in spectacle as spectacle. It is interested in what it means to have power you didn't ask for and can't control. And it is interested in that question through the lens of a very specific community of people who are not heroes by nature or by choice. In that sense, it is the kind of superhero story that the cultural moment is arguably more ready for than the genre has traditionally offered. And whether that is by design or fortune, the result is a show that feels fresh even within an exhausted genre space. The show streaming live on Netflix appears to be off to a strong start. Based on early reporting about viewership in its opening weeks, those specific numbers are not publicly confirmed at the time of writing. What is clear is that the show has entered the conversation among K-drama enthusiasts globally in a way that signals it will have a substantial and sustained afterlife on the platform. Whether it will achieve the extraordinary mainstream crossover of something like Squid Game or extraordinarily Eun-woo remains to be seen. My sense is that it won't, primarily because it is less sensationally high concept than either of those shows and more dependent on an appreciation of its ensemble character work than either of those shows needed from international audiences. But within its specific audience, K-drama enthusiasts, superhero drama fans, viewers who came to Park Eun-bin through extraordinary Eun-woo, it seems positioned to become a genuine favorite rather than a flash-in-the-pan trending item. And genuine favorites are ultimately more meaningful for a show's legacy than momentary dominance. Does it feel timeless or of its era? Here is my honest answer. It is both in different proportions, depending on which layer you're looking at. The 1999 setting and the specific nostalgia it generates are absolutely of an era. You cannot separate this show from its period setting without changing what it is, and in 15 years it will function partly as a time capsule of a very specific cultural moment. But the emotional core, the story of people who gained something extraordinary and struggled to make it fit inside the ordinary lives they already had, that is not of an era. That is a story about the human experience of being given more than you asked for, more than you feel ready for, more than your existing self can comfortably accommodate, and having to decide what to do with that. That story is as old as stories. And The Wonderfuls tells it with enough warmth and enough honesty that I think it will still matter to people when the Y2K backdrop is purely historical rather than even partially remembered. That is what separates a good show from a great one. Not the surface dressing, but the depth of the humanity underneath it. The Wonderfuls is not great, but it is genuinely and meaningfully good, and it has the right ingredients to become something people return to. Now let's go deeper. Because the story of the Wonderfools is on the surface about a group of clumsy people in a small Korean city who accidentally get superpowers and fight crime in 1999. And everything about that surface is true and genuinely entertaining. But underneath it, the show is doing something more specific and more interesting. And I want to spend some time here before we go into the full spoilers talking about what that is. Because this is the layer that, once you see it, makes everything else resonate differently. This is what the show is actually about, beneath the superpowers and the comedy and the 1999 nostalgia. Here's where it gets layered. The Wonderfools is at its deepest level a show about the experience of being defective, not broken, defective. The distinction matters. The show's central concept, that its characters are flawed superhumans, people who have powers they cannot fully control or use at will, is not simply a comic premise. It is a deliberate and intelligent metaphor for a very common human experience. which is the experience of having a quality or capacity in yourself that you sense could be valuable, even extraordinary, but that you have not yet found a way to use in a way that doesn't also cause damage. The comedy of a superpower you can't control is genuinely funny, but underneath the comedy is something that connects directly to a feeling most people know. The feeling of knowing you could do something, of sensing that you have something in you that matters, while simultaneously being unable to make it work in any clean or reliable way. The frustration, the embarrassment, the unchosen isolation of being more than you know how to be. The Wonderfools takes that experience and makes it literal and visible and comedic, and in doing so, it makes it bearable to laugh at in a way that secretly, quietly, makes it easier to feel. There is also a strand of the show's thematic interest that runs through the 1999 setting specifically, a meditation on the experience of waiting for a disaster that may or may not come. The Y2K anxiety is not just period atmosphere. It is a structural metaphor for the way all of us sometimes live in anticipation of catastrophe, carrying the weight of something that hasn't happened yet, organizing our emotional lives around a threat whose actual arrival remains uncertain. Chae-ni, Jeong-hoon, Robin, each of them is carrying a version of this anticipatory dread before the superpowers arrive, a private catastrophe they are waiting for and bracing against. The arrival of the powers is, in one reading of the show, simply the private catastrophe finally becoming visible. The thing they were afraid might happen to them, or in them, or through them. It happened. And the question the show spends the rest of its episodes asking is, what do you do with a disaster once it arrives? Do you spend your life managing the damage, trying to keep the power from hurting anyone, keeping it contained and controlled and private? Or do you find a way to use it imperfectly, messily, with full knowledge that you will sometimes get it wrong, in service of something that matters? That is not a superhero question. That is a human question, and the Wonderfuls knows it. The superhero format is the vehicle, but the destination is something much closer to home. The relationship between Chae-ni and her grandmother is another side of the show's deeper thematic work, specifically its exploration of the way love and legacy operate across generations. Jeonbok's past, which the show reveals carefully and compassionately over the course of the series, is connected to the present crisis in Haeseong in ways that neither of them initially understands. And when that connection becomes clear, it does something very specific to the emotional landscape of their relationship. It means that what is happening to Chae-ni is not accidental, not random, not simply bad luck striking an ordinary person. It is, in some sense, the arrival of a story that has been moving toward Chae-ni for longer than she has been alive. A story that belongs to her grandmother and that has now, in the specific way that inherited burdens do, arrived at the doorstep of the next generation. The show handles these intergenerational racial resonance with a genuine delicacy. It never becomes melodrama, never becomes a lecture about legacy and responsibility. It arrives quietly, the way inherited things always arrive, not with a declaration but with a gradual recognition. Oh, this was always going to be mine to deal with. And the question is, what I do with that? Connected to this is the show's treatment of community, of what it means to be rooted in a specific place and to have a responsibility to that place that goes beyond the formal or the official. Punjung arrives in Haeseong as an agent of a system, a civic servant with a mandate and a protocol. His relationship to the city is professional, bounded, temporary. What happens to him over the course of the series is not simply that he falls for someone who lives there. What happens is that the city gets under his skin in a way no city has before, because for the first time in his professional life, he is not keeping himself at the procedure distance that his training prescribed. Kaini will not allow that distance. The city will not allow that distance. And the result is that Wonjong, by the end of the series, has been transformed by the experience of belonging somewhere, genuinely, messily, personally belonging in a way he had not allowed himself in years. That transformation is the show's most quietly radical emotional argument. That community, specific, inconvenient, demanding, imperfect community is one of the few things genuinely capable of changing a person. not making them better in a smooth, linear sense, but cracking them open in ways that allow something new to grow. This is what the Wonderfools believes. And it makes that argument not through speeches but through 100 accumulated small moments, through the specific friction of people who have no reason to belong to each other finding reasons anyway. The show's title, when you sit with it, carries more meaning than it might initially appear to. A wonderful is, in the show's construction, someone who is wonderful and foolish simultaneously, not in sequence, where the foolishness leads to the wonder or the wonder is achieved despite the foolishness, but at the same time, these characters are wonderful precisely because they are foolish. Their powers are wonderful precisely because they are flawed. Their heroism is wonderful precisely because they have absolutely no business being heroes and know it and do it anyway. That combination, wonder and foolishness as inseparable conditions rather than opposing ones, is the show's emotional thesis. And it is a thesis that extends beyond the superhero premise into something much more broadly human. Most of us are wonderfuls. Most of us are attempting things we are not fully equipped to attempt, armed with capacities that don't always cooperate, in a world that does not always accommodate our particular combination of gifted and defective. The show's argument is not that this is a problem to be solved, it's that this is the condition, and that it is, in the right company, something close to wonderful. Now, it is time to open this box all the way. Full spoilers from this point. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the show yet, close this now. Go watch it and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. Still here? Good, because this is where we go all the way in. Every twist, every hidden layer, every piece of foreshadowing that the show plants so carefully in its early episodes that you walk right past it the first time. Every detail that hits differently once you know what's coming. This is the full breakdown, and there is a lot to open. Let's start at the beginning of what the show is actually doing, because the first episode of The Wonderfuls contains more structural architecture than almost anyone notices on a first watch. The opening sequence. Chinese morning. The restaurant, the city waking up in 1999, is playing two games simultaneously. On the surface, it is establishing character and world with the confident efficiency of a production that knows exactly who these people are. Underneath that, it is doing something much more specific. It is establishing, in visual terms, the exact geography of the crisis that will unfold. Every location in that opening montage becomes significant later. The back alley behind the restaurant where Chae-ni takes a shortcut every morning. That is the location of the incident that triggers the powers. The specific corner of the City Hall courtyard where Kyung-hoon always eats his lunch alone. That is where he first involuntarily and disastrously manifests his ability in public. The bridge at the edge of the neighborhood that Ruo-bin crosses every evening on his way home. That bridge would become the site of a confrontation in episode 7 that the show has been building towards since the opening frames. The geography is not accidental. Eun-sik and his production team laid out Haeseong City in those first minutes as a map of the entire emotional journey. You just didn't know you were looking at a map yet. The inciting incident, the moment that triggers the powers, is the single most carefully constructed scene in the first two episodes, and it rewards extremely close attention on a rewatch. What happens precisely is this. Diane is in the back alley behind the restaurant one evening when she witnesses something she cannot immediately process. A man is there who should not be there. He is doing something to a piece of equipment that Cheney recognizes. It is part of the building's infrastructure, something mundane and mechanical, but the way he is doing it is wrong. This specific wrongness is something Cheney feels before she can articulate it. The way you feel when something familiar is slightly off in a way that your conscious mind hasn't caught up with yet. She challenges him. There is a confrontation, and in the course of that confrontation, something happens that the show presents initially as an accident, a collision, a discharge of some kind of energy, a moment that is loud and disorienting and over very quickly, that leaves Johnny on the ground in the alley, and the man gone. Here is what most people miss on a first watch. The man is not a random stranger. The show does not reveal this until episode 4, but on a rewatch, he is visually identifiable from the very first frame he appears in. The specific detail, and I want to be exact about this because it is a beautiful piece of long game screenwriting, is a small scar on his left hand, visible for approximately 2 seconds in the alley confrontation scene, which reappears in a scene in episode 2 where the character of Ha Won-do is shown in close-up working at his desk. The scar is on the same hand, in the same position. The inciting incident and the antagonist's bevel are the same event, and the show tells you this in plain visual language in the first episode, if you know where to look. Most viewers don't know where to look the first time, but the show is not hiding it. It is displaying it openly, confident that narrative momentum will carry you past a detail that is too small to register as significant until you already know the answer. That is honest storytelling. That is a show that is playing fair with its audience while trusting that the audience will not catch up until the right moment. The distinction between that kind of mystery construction and the kind that cheats by withholding information is enormous, and the Wonderfools is consistently on the right side of it. What the discharge of energy in the alley does to Cheney is, at first, nothing she can identify. She goes home. She tells her grandmother she fell. She goes to sleep. And then the following morning, something happens in the kitchen of the restaurant that is the show's first full demonstration of what Chae-ni has been given, her power. And I want to describe it carefully because the show's choice of power for each character is itself a piece of thematic encoding that tells you something important about who that person is a form of extremely acute sensory amplification combined with a physical response to threat that she cannot control. When Chinese is startled or frightened or placed in a situation of sudden danger, her body responds with a speed and force that is entirely disproportionate to the normal human capacity for reaction, and the results in the early episodes are extraordinary in the worst possible way. She breaks things, she knocks people over, she moves through spaces at a velocity that she cannot predict or direct. The power is not something she uses. It is something that uses her, that moves through her, that is triggered by exactly the kind of sudden, unpredictable, chaotic circumstances that Cheney's life has always been full of. The commodity of this is immediate and rich. A woman who was already the city's most architecturally dangerous resident is now, additionally, physically superhuman. But the thematic resonance is what I want to underline. Chinese power is a literalization of the thing that has always been true about her. She has always reacted to the world with more intensity than the world expected. She has always moved through spaces with more velocity than they were designed to accommodate. The superpower doesn't change who she is. It just makes it visible, physical, impossible to ignore or dismiss as a personality quirk. The power is the person. That thematic clarity in the power design is one of the most intelligent decisions the show makes. Kyung-hoon's power is, if anything, even more thematically precise. Son Kyung-hoon gains the ability to make himself, and specifically his voice, impossible to ignore. When Kyung-hoon speaks with a certain intensity of conviction, people around him cannot help but listen. They cannot look away. They cannot dismiss or interrupt or talk over him. His words carry a kind of compulsive auditory weight that functions, in practice, like a low-level form of mind influence, not control, not the ability to make people do things against their will, but the ability to make them genuinely physically unable to do anything but hear him out. The comedy of this is almost too perfectly constructed. A man who has spent his entire life as Haeseong City's most persistent complainer, whose defining quality is an inability to accept not being heard, whose entire identity is built around the formal expression of grievance, that man gains the power to make everyone around him listen. It is exactly what he wanted, and it is, of course, absolutely terrible in practice, because Seung-hoon does not simply have important things to say that have been unjustly ignored. He has an inexhaustible supply of things to say. most of which are of moderate to low importance, and the power to force everyone in a room to hear every single one of them is a power that will make Kyung-hoon the most hated person in any space he occupies if he's not careful. The show plays this beautifully across 4 episodes before arriving at the moment in episode 5, in the scene I described earlier without full details, where Kyung-hoon uses his power not to complain, not to demand, not to insist on being heard, but to say something true and difficult and necessary in a situation where no one else had the courage to say it. In that moment, the power becomes what it was always meant to be, not the amplification of his grievances, but the vehicle for the one thing a man who is always listened to can offer that no one else can, the willingness to speak an uncomfortable truth in a room full of people who would rather not hear it. That transformation, from the comedy of a man who talks too much to the genuine heroism of a man who says what needs to be said, is one of the show's most satisfying character journeys, and it is built with such care that the payoff feels completely inevitable in retrospect. Robin's power is the show's most subtle and most emotionally complex choice. Kang Robin gains what could most accurately be described as a form of empathic permeability, the ability to physically experience the emotional states of people around him, not as a vague sense of their feelings, but as a direct physical sensation that registers in his own body. When someone near him is afraid, he feels it in his chest. When someone near him is angry, he feels it in his hands. When someone near him is in physical pain, he feels a version of that pain in the corresponding location in his own body. The power has a range, roughly a few meters, and it is constantly active. He cannot turn it off. He has no filter. He is living at all times in a state of complete exposure to the emotional reality of everyone in his immediate vicinity. The comedy dimension of this, a man who could never protect himself from the social demands of people around him is now literally incapable of protecting himself from their inner states, is dark and sharp, and the show handles it with an awareness of its darkness that prevents it from ever being merely comic. Because what the show is actually doing with Rubin's power is taking the thing that was always true about him, his extraordinary emotional sensitivity, his inability to insulate himself from other people's needs, his permeability to the unspoken emotional weather of a room, and making it a physical fact. He was always feeling everything. Now he just can't pretend otherwise. And the moment in episode 5 that I mentioned earlier, the scene played completely straight with no comedy, is the scene where Robin, sitting alone, is for the first time unable to feel anyone else's pain because he is too deep in his own. His own grief is large enough to block everything else out. And Im Sung-jae plays that specific discovery, the discovery that his own pain finally exists at the same volume as everyone else's, with a silence that is one of the most genuine moments of acting in the entire series. Now let's talk about Ha Don, because he is the engine of the show's plot even as the ensemble characters are the engine of its heart, and understanding what he is doing and why is essential to understanding the show's final act. Won-do is not the show's villain in the simple sense. He is something more specific and more interesting than that. He is the show's exploration of what happens when someone who understands the truth about power better than anyone uses that understanding not in service of others but in service of their own unexamined desperation. Wando knows about the powers. He has known about them for much longer than the audience initially realizes. The revelation in episode 4, which I will describe in full now, is that the powers are not random. They are not the accidental result of a discharged piece of equipment in an alley. They are the latest manifestation of a phenomenon that Haswondu has been studying, manipulating, and attempting to control for years. The energy discharge in the alley was not an accident. It was a test. Jenny was not randomly chosen. She was observed, assessed, and selected. The reason for that selection is where the show's backstory reveals its most emotionally significant layer. Won-do, we learn, is a former researcher. The show describes him as having worked in a field adjacent to what we might recognize as paranormal studies, though within the show's world this is treated as legitimate scientific territory. Who lost someone? A child. His own daughter, who had exhibited early signs of the same kind of power that Chae-ni and the others now possess, and who died because, without understanding, without help, without anyone around her who could recognize what was happening for what it was, her power consumed her before she could learn to manage it. Wondu watched his daughter destroyed by something that he now understands could have been managed, controlled, even turned into something extraordinary, if only someone had known what it was in time. That loss is the engine of everything he does in the present. He is not a man who wants power for its own sake. He is a man who became obsessed with mastery and control because the cost of not having mastery and control was the thing he loved most in the world. This is where Soniju's performance reveals all its depth, because Hwando's methods are genuinely harmful. The disappearances that Won Jong was sent to investigate are connected to him, to earlier experiments, to people who were selected as test subjects without consent and who did not survive the process. And yet, the man behind those methods is not a monster in the cartoonish sense. He is a father who could not save his daughter and has spent every year since trying to build the knowledge that might have saved her, at a cost to others that he has found ways not to fully reckon with. The show does not ask you to forgive him. It does not present his grief as a justification, but it does ask you to understand him in a way that refuses the comfort of simple villainy, and that refusal is one of the most mature decisions the writing makes. The disappearances are real, the harm is real, and the grief that generated it is also real. All three things are simultaneously true, and the show holds all three without resolving the tension between them into something neater than it actually is. The connection to Jeonbok, Kim Hee-suk's grandmother character, is the reveal that reshapes everything. The glamorous and dark past that the show has been teasing through small details since episode 1 is this. Jeonbok knew Hwando, not casually. She knew him in a capacity that the show describes carefully and that I want to walk through precisely. Yeonbok, when she was young, before Haeseong, before the restaurant, before the life she built for herself and then for Chae-ni, was one of the earliest people in whom this kind of anomalous ability manifested, not in the overt, physically dramatic way that characterizes the current generation of powered individuals, but in a quieter, subtler form that was more easily hidden and more easily denied. Yeonbok's ability, as the show describes it across the middle episodes, was an extraordinarily refined form of perception, the ability to sense with uncanny accuracy the true emotional state and hidden intention of anyone she came into sustained contact with. It sounds gentle. It was, in her experience, anything but. Because there is nothing gentle about knowing with certainty things about the people around you that they have not chosen to share, about feeling the gap between what people present and what they carry, all the time, without respite. Yeonbok's connection to Hwando is this: he found her decades ago, when he was at the beginning of his obsession, when the wound of his daughter's death was still fresh and his methods were less refined and his willingness to harm others in the pursuit of understanding was still forming. He approached Jeonbok not as a subject for experiment but as a potential collaborator. She was, according to his understanding, the most fully developed, naturally occurring instance of ability he had encountered, and he wanted to learn from her. What happened between them is the show's most carefully guarded piece of backstory, revealed in pieces across episodes 4, 5, and 6, and I want to trace those pieces in the order they arrive because the sequencing of their revelation is itself a piece of the story. The first piece arrives in episode 4 in the scene I described earlier, the quiet domestic moment where something is revealed about Jeonbok's past. What is revealed is not the full story. What is revealed is simply that Jeonbok knows more about what is happening to Chae-ni than she has admitted. She recognizes the signs. She has seen this before. And she knows, without yet being willing to say how she knows, that what is happening to her granddaughter is not the first time this has been in the family. Park Eun-bin plays Chae-ni's reception of this information, the dawning realization that her grandmother's silence on certain subjects was not in curiosity but protection, with a restraint that is characteristic of the show's best emotional choices. She doesn't break down, she doesn't accuse, she simply becomes very still in a way that signals how many things are being reorganized inside her simultaneously. The second piece arrives in episode 5, and it is the reveal that Jeon-bok and Ha-won-do had a sustained professional relationship. She worked with him willingly for a period of time because she believed his stated intention to understand, to protect, to prevent the harm that had come to his daughter from coming to others. She was not naive. She was deliberate. She chose to trust him, and she brought everything she understood about her own ability to that collaboration, and for a period of time the collaboration was genuinely productive. They understood more together than either had alone. This revelation is important because it complicates the show's moral landscape considerably. Jeon Bok, the show's warmest and most trusted character, participated in the project that eventually became the thing threatening her granddaughter. Not in its harmful iteration, not in the phase that involved non consenting subjects, but in the foundational phase that made all subsequent phases possible. She gave him the understanding that he later used in ways she did not sanction and could not have anticipated. The show's willingness to hold this complexity, to make the grandmother morally implicated without making her villainous, is one of its most impressive ethical choices. The third piece is the end of that collaboration, and it is the most emotionally significant element of Janbok's backstory. She left. She saw where the project was heading, saw the shift in Ha-won-do from genuine researcher to something harder and more desperate, saw the moment when the question changed from how do we understand this to how do we control this, and she took herself out of it. She built a new life. She made Haeseong her home. She had a family and she buried the past as completely as a person can, which is to say, not quite completely enough. And what the show quietly asks you to sit with, in the scenes between Jeonbok and Jenny after this revelation, is whether leaving was enough. Whether Jeonbok's departure constituted an adequate moral response to what she knew was coming, or whether she had a continuing responsibility that she chose out of love for the life she had built to avoid. The show does not answer this question directly. Kim Hae-suk's performance answers it in the affirmative. You can see the weight of that question in every scene Jeonbok occupies once her full history is known. But the script is wise enough not to resolve it through dialogue. Some questions don't get resolved, they just get carried. Won-do's discovery that Chae-ni is Jeonbok's granddaughter, which he makes in episode 5, shortly after the audience makes it, is the moment the threat becomes personal in the fullest sense. He was not, initially, targeting Jeonbok's family. The selection of Chae-ni was based on the power signatures he had been tracking across Haeseong, and the connection to Jeonbok was a discovery that came after the selection, not before. But once he knows it, the dynamic shifts. Because Ha-won-do and Jeonbok have unfinished business, and that unfinished business is not simply professional, it is the business of what she took with her when she left. The specific knowledge, the specific understanding of her own ability, the records and documentation she removed from the project when she departed. Ha-won-do needs those records, not to harm Jeonbok. The show is careful to establish that his relationship to her even now is something more complicated than hostility. He needs them because without them, his understanding of the ability in its fully developed form remains incomplete. An incomplete understanding in his experience is fatal. It was fatal to his daughter. Let's trace what this means for Woon Jong's investigation, because the parallel investigation storyline is doing something structurally important that the full spoiler film allows us to appreciate completely. Woon Jong arrives in Haeseong with a very specific theory about the disappearances. He believes, based on the pattern of cases and the demographics of the missing individuals, that there is a deliberate selection process at work. He is right. What he does not yet know is the selection criterion. His initial working theory is that the disappearances are connected to specific professional or social groupings, a community network of some kind, a shared affiliation that marks its members as targets. He is partially right about this too. The shared affiliation is real, but it is not a professional or social one, it is a biological one. The missing people are all individuals who showed signs of the same kind of anomalous ability that Chae-ni and her neighbors now possess. Earlier manifestations, earlier test subjects, people who were in the early phases of their ability emerging and who Hwando located and brought into his project before their powers were fully developed or publicly known. Some of them were consenting, in the limited sense that they understood something unusual was happening to them and agreed to participate in research about it. Others were not. This is the darkest element of Hwondo's history, and the show handles it with the analytical gravity it deserves rather than using it as spectacle. The harm is named, the non consent is named. The deaths that resulted from experiments conducted beyond ethical limits are named, but they are named in service of understanding the weight of what the antagonist carries and the full scope of what the protagonists are opposing, not in service of graphic recreation. Woon-jung's discovery of the biological connection. The moment in episode 6 where the pattern in the cases finally becomes fully visible to him is staged as a quiet scene rather than a dramatic revelation, and that choice is absolutely correct. He is alone in his workspace in Haeseong, late at night, surrounded by the files he has been organizing and reorganizing for weeks, and the moment the pattern clicks into focus is shown through a very simple directorial choice. The camera pulls back very slowly from a close up of the files on his desk until you can see not the individual documents but the arrangement of them, the spatial relationship between cases, the shape that the layout of files on the desk creates, and the shape is a network, a web. With a center, the camera holds on that shape for a moment, just long enough for the audience to understand that Woon-jung has seen it too, and then he closes the file and sits very still. No music. No dramatic score. Just a man sitting with the knowledge of something terrible, deciding what to do with it. Chow Wumbu's stillness in that moment is the scene's performance, and it is completely right. The convergence of the investigation and the powered characters, the moment when these two parallel storylines are forced into direct contact with each other, arrives in episode 6 with the speed and force that the show earns completely because of how carefully it kept the storylines separate in the preceding episodes. Woon-jung's investigation leads him to a location on the edge of Haeseong where Hao Won-do has been conducting his current phase of research, a converted building that the show has been showing us in background frame since episode 2, always just visible enough to register as a location without ever being centered enough to demand attention. This is one of the show's finest pieces of spatial foreshadowing. The building is always there, always present in the peripheral vision of the city's geography, like a thing that has been waiting to become important. When it finally becomes the center of the story, you have the specific feeling of something that was always in the room finally stepping into the light. What Woon-jung finds there is enough to definitively close the investigative question he was sent to Hae-sung to answer. The disappearances were connected. The person responsible is identified. The evidence is significant. And in any procedural version of the story, this would be where the civic servant contacts his superiors, submits his report, and lets the formal apparatus of authority handle what comes next. Woon-chung, for the first time in his professional career, does not do that. He calls Chae-ni instead. This is the moment that marks the completion of his character arc in the most fundamental sense. Not a falling in love, that is a consequence of this moment, not its content. The content of this moment is the choice to involve himself personally, to bring the person he trusts most in Hae-sung into his most important professional situation, to make a judgment call that overrides his protocol and his training and his career-long insistence that feelings do not belong in the work. He makes that call because he has realized, somewhere in the 6 episodes since he arrived, that the work and the feelings are not separate things, that the investigation matters because the people in the city matter, and the people matter to him specifically, and that specific mattering is not a contamination of his judgment, but the truest expression of why the judgment is being made at all. That phone call, which the show keeps deliberately brief, almost casual in its staging, is one of the most emotionally significant events in the entire series, precisely because it contains all of that transformation in 4 or 5 short sentences and a quality of voice that tells you everything about what has changed. The ensemble convergence in episodes 6 and 7, all four powered characters working together for the first time in any coordinated sense against a common threat, is where the show's full tonal architecture reveals itself. Because these four people, Chae-ni, Kyung-hoon, Robin, and Woon-jung, are still, even at this point, spectacular disasters as a team. They cannot coordinate. Their powers still operate with the reliability of early prototype machinery. They have conflicting instincts about strategy that reflect their conflicting personalities with painful accuracy. Jong-hoon wants to make a formal plan and have everyone agree to it before proceeding. Robin is too busy absorbing the emotional static of everyone around him to offer tactical input. Tiny wants to move immediately because standing still while there is something to be done is not an option her nervous system will accept. And Woon Jung, the only person in the group who has any professional training for high-stakes situations, keeps trying to impose a structure on proceedings that the other three cheerfully and repeatedly undermine. The result is objectively a mess, and the mess works because the mess is the point. The show is not building toward a moment where these four people finally become a competent superhero team in the way the genre conventionally demands. It is building toward a moment where these four people face something genuinely threatening with full knowledge of how bad they are at this and choose to face it anyway, and somehow, through the specific and irreplaceable combination of their specific and irreplaceable inadequacies, find a way through. The heroism is not in the competence, the heroism is in the showing up. There is a sequence in episode 7 that is, I think, the emotional peak of the entire series, and I want to describe it in the detail it deserves. The four of them are in a position where the immediate threat has escalated beyond anything their individual powers are suited to address, and the logical response, the procedurally correct response, the response that Woon Jung would have recommended 2 months ago, is to retreat, to call for external authority, to acknowledge the limits of what they can do. And Kyung-hoon, of all people, is the one who refuses. Not with heroic rhetoric, not with a speech. What he does is step forward and use his power, his compulsive attention power, not to force anyone to listen to him, but to hold the situation in place long enough for the others to regroup. He speaks, loudly, continuously, to an adversary who cannot tune him out. And what he says, in the sequence that Im Sung-jae and Choi Dae-hoon and Park Eun-bin are all visible in the background of, is a lengthy, passionate, formally structured grievance about the specific civic regulations that Hwang-do's operations have violated in the city of Haeseong. He is filing a formal complaint in real time, in the middle of a life-threatening situation. Why people he has come to think of as colleagues, not friends, he would not use that word, but colleagues, which for Kyung-hoon represents an enormous emotional concession, regroup behind him. It is the funniest scene in the show, and it is also one of the most genuinely moving scenes in the show. And the fact that it is both of those things simultaneously, without one quality diminishing the other by so much as a millimeter, is the proof of everything the show has been building. This is a Wonderful in action. This is the show's thesis made flesh. Wonderfools in one body at the same moment, doing the one thing only that specific combination of qualities could accomplish. The resolution of the Hatwando storyline is handled with a complexity that I want to acknowledge directly, because I think it is one of the show's genuinely brave choices. He is not defeated in the traditional antagonist sense. He is not beaten in a climactic physical confrontation. He is not arrested in the formal procedural sense that Woon Jung's initial investigation might have suggested. what happens, and the show earns this ending through the full weight of what has been built about who Hwando is a confrontation between him and Jeonbok, just the two of them, in a scene that the other characters are present for but do not fully understand, because the full weight of what is happening in the room requires the specific history that only these two people share. Eun-woo gives him the records he needs, the ones she took when she left. She has had them for decades, and she gives them to him, not because she has decided that his methods were acceptable, not because she is endorsing what he did or forgiving the harm he caused. She gives them to him because she understands finally and completely that the need that drove him is real and that the knowledge is not itself harmful. What was harmful was what he did in the absence of that knowledge, the experiments, the harm to others, conducted by someone who was trying to reach understanding through any available means because the gap in his understanding had cost him his daughter. She is not giving him a weapon, she is giving him what he should have been given from the beginning, the chance to understand, without harm, the thing that mattered most to him. This moment is where Kim Hae-suk and Son Hyun-joo do the finest work either of them does in the series. Because what passes between Jeonbok and Hwando in this scene is not forgiveness. It is not reconciliation. It is something much more difficult and much more honest, acknowledgement. She acknowledges that he is still the person she knew, the person capable of genuine understanding and genuine loss, even after everything he became in the absence of what he needed. He acknowledges, without using the word, that the harm he caused was real and cannot be undone, and was not justified by the grief that generated it. These two things, his genuine human tragedy and the genuine harm of his methods, exist simultaneously in the scene, and neither Jeonbok nor Ha Won-do tries to collapse them into a simpler truth. They stand in the same room with the full complexity of what happened between them and the world, and they do not resolve it. They just witness it together. And then the records change hands, and the scene ends, and Ha Won-do walks out of Haeseong City, not arrested, not destroyed, leaving with what he came for into a future the show deliberately leaves unshown. That ambiguity is a choice, and it is the right choice for this specific story about the specific complexity of people who do real harm from real pain. Woon Jung's response to the outcome of the investigation is where his arc completes. He filed his report. The formal record of what happened in Haeseong is accurate and full, and does not omit what how Won-do did. The people who disappeared are named. The harm is documented. Won Jung does not protect Ha Won-do from the official record, but he also does not oppose the specific way their resolution happened, does not insist on a formal arrest, does not challenge Jindok's decision about the records, because he has learned in Hae Song the difference between justice as a system and justice as an outcome, and he has decided in this specific situation with full awareness of the personal bias that decision involves that the outcome is sufficient and the system would not have produced something better. This is not a comfortable position for a man who has built his entire professional identity around the primacy of procedure, and the show does not make it comfortable. Won Jung's final scenes with his superiors in Seoul, shown in a brief but precisely observed sequence near the end of episode 8, carry the specific discomfort of a person who has made a judgment he cannot fully defend to the institutional framework he operates within, and who has decided to carry that discomfort rather than retroactively justify the decision by pretending it was procedurally clean. He accepts the ambiguity. That acceptance is the character's most important growth, more significant than any romantic development, and it is played by Chao Eun-woo in those final soul scenes with a specific quality of quiet that is completely different from the beginning of series quiet. Less defensive, more inhabited, more aware of itself. Now let's talk about Chae-ni's power in the final episodes, because there is a dimension to it that the show holds back until episode 7 that recontextualizes everything about how the power has been used and understood throughout the series. In the early episode, Chae-ni's power was presented entirely as a defensive response mechanism, triggered by threat or surprise, manifesting as accelerated physical reaction. In episode 7, in the confrontation sequence, something different happens. Jenny is not startled or surprised or frightened. She is determined. She knows exactly what she is walking toward. And the power manifests anyway, but in a different register. Not the explosive, uncontrolled response of the early episodes. Something focused, something that, for the first time, she chooses. She does not choose the specific form it takes. The mechanics are still beyond her full control, but the initiation is hers. The decision to move, to be present, to engage fully with the situation she is in, that decision comes from inside her, and the power responds to it. The show does not make a big moment of this shift. It does not slow down and underline it with music or a close up on Chae-ni's face. It simply shows it happening and trusts the audience to understand what they are seeing. The first moment of genuine ownership. The first moment where the power is not using Chae-ni but Chae-ni is, however imperfectly, however provisionally, using the power. That is the character's completed arc, shown through physical action rather than stated through dialogue. The show earned that moment across 7 episodes of carefully observed chaos, and it lands with an authority that no speech could have matched. There is a piece of foreshadowing in episode 2 that I want to flag because it is probably the most elegant piece of long range structural setup in the series, and I have never seen it discussed in any of the reviews or audience responses I have encountered. It is a very small moment. Chae-ni and Woon-jung are in the same space for only the second time in the show, and they are at maximum distance from each other, on opposite sides of the room, barely in the same scene, their interaction limited to a single brief exchange about something wholly practical. The camera frames them in a wide shot that places a very specific object in the exact center of the flame, equidistant between them. The object is a clock, a old analog clock on the wall of whatever municipal space they are in, showing a time that, if you stop the episode and look, is 11,059, almost midnight, almost the end of something. The show places this clock in the dead center of the first real two-shot it gives its leads. In 1999, with the millennium a few weeks away at 11:30:99, and then it cuts away and never comments on it. On a first watch, you notice it in the peripheral way. You notice production design that is doing its job, creating a sense of period, filling the world with visual texture. On a rewatch, with full knowledge of everything the show is going to do with these two characters, and with the year 1999 as an emotional container, it is an image so precise in its symbolism that it feels almost impossibly well constructed. Almost midnight, waiting, everything about to change. Two people in the same room who don't know yet what they are to each other. The image is the whole show. The final episode, episode 8, operates at a different pace and a different emotional temperature than everything that preceded it, and this is a deliberate choice that I think is correct, even though it takes some adjustment. After the sustained tension and escalating stakes of episode 6 and 7, episode 8 slows down. It breathes. It spends time with people who have just been through something significant and are now in the aftermath, which is its own distinct emotional territory that different shows handle very differently. The Wonderfools handles it by returning to the specific geography of Haeseong, the restaurant, the streets, the bridge, the courtyard, and allowing its characters to exist in those spaces without the pressure of crisis. This is not a cooling off in the narrative sense of a show running out of energy. It is a deliberate act of emotional attentiveness, the show saying, these people and this place matter to us beyond their utility as story engines, and we are going to spend time with them simply existing before we say goodbye. The scene between Chae-ni and Jeonbok in the restaurant kitchen in episode 8 is the scene I have returned to most. It is a long scene by the standards of this genre, nearly 7 minutes, in which almost nothing happens in the narrative sense. Chae-ni is helping prepare food. Jeonbok is working alongside her. They talk. They talk about ordinary things. The restaurant, the neighborhood, a customer who has been coming for decades and who both of them know well. And underneath those ordinary things, they are talking about everything that happened. Not directly, in the specific sideways language of people who know each other completely and do not need the direct route to get somewhere. Kini tells her grandmother that the restaurant smells the same as it always has, which is a way of saying you are still yourself to me, even knowing what I know now. Jean Bok tells Chae-ni that the recipe hasn't changed in 30 years, which is a way of saying some things that are true about a person were true before anyone could name them. The dialogue is doing two things simultaneously, the surface thing and the depth thing, and Park Eun-bin and Kim Ha-suk play both with an easiness that is the hardest thing to achieve. This is what it looks like when two performers understand not just their own character but the full history between their characters and the specific shorthand that history has created. It is one of the best scenes of either actress's career. I mean that without qualification. Won Jong's final scenes in Haeseong, before he returns to Seoul, before the series closes, contain one moment that I want to pinpoint exactly because it is the most emotionally precise thing the show does in its final hour. He and Tiny are at the bridge. The bridge at the edge of the neighborhood that Eun-bin used to cross every evening, that the show established in its first frames as a significant location. It is early morning. The light has the specific quality of first light, the quality that belongs to the hour before the world fully wakes up. And Woon Jung, who has spent the entire series arriving at things too late or too carefully to say them directly, says something. Not a declaration in the genre sense, not the specific configuration of words that Korean drama has a long and rich tradition of deploying at its romantic peaks. What he says is a small, specific, practical observation about Haeseong City, about something he noticed about the way it was that he had not noticed about any place he had been before. It is the kind of observation that only someone who has genuinely lived inside a place, not observed it professionally, not passed through it, but been changed by it, could make. And in the specific context of everything the show has established about who Woon Jong is, a man who kept cities at procedural distance as a matter of professional survival, the ability to make that observation is itself the declaration. Chae-ni understands this. You can see her understand it. The camera holds. The show breathes. And then the scene continues, as ordinary as it is extraordinary. There is no post-credits scene in The Wonderfools. This is a choice worth noting, because the absence of one is itself a statement about what kind of story this is. The show is not setting up a sequel in the conventional sense. It is not leaving a thread hanging that requires the next installment to resolve. It ends complete, with its characters changed but intact, its world altered but recognizable, its questions answered in the ways they can be answered, and honestly unresolved in the ways they cannot be. The absence of a post-credits tease is the show's final act of confidence in its own material. It doesn't need to promise you more. It trusts that what it gave you was sufficient. And it is. My personal reaction to the ending of The Wonderfuls is something I want to be honest about, because I think the honesty is more useful than a smooth critical summary. The ending moved me more than I expected, not in the specific dramatic way of a story that builds to an emotional detonation, but in the quieter, more persistent way of a story that has spent its full runtime accumulating small true things about people, and that in its final episode simply allows those accumulated true things to coexist without trying to resolve them into a single conclusive statement. I found myself in the last 20 minutes of episode 8 aware of a very specific kind of feeling. The feeling you get when you have spent a long time with people you have come to care about, and you can feel the time with them running out. Not grief, exactly, more like the specific gratitude of having been present for something genuine. The show gave me real people. Not real in the sense of representational accuracy, but real in the sense that mattered. Emotionally specific, internally consistent, capable of surprising me in ways that felt true to who they were rather than required by plot. That is the hardest thing to do in ensemble storytelling, and the Wonderfuls did it. That is why the ending hit the way it did, because by the time it arrived, I genuinely cared where these people ended up, and the show knew that, and it was careful with it. There is one final hidden detail I want to mention before we close the spoiler section, because it is the kind of thing that rewards a rewatch and that I think is worth calling out explicitly for anyone who plans to go back to the series. In every episode of The Wonderfools, there is a brief moment, sometimes just 2 or 3 seconds, where all four of the powered characters are in the same frame without any of them being aware of it. Not as a plot point, not as in narrative conversions. Just there, in the same visual space, going about their separate lives in the city they all inhabit. In episode 1, it is in the background of a street scene. In episode 2, it is in a wide shot of a market. In episode 3, it is in a single frame of a community meeting at the city hall where they are all present but seated apart and facing different directions. The show does this in every episode, through episode 5 when they come together deliberately, and then stops. Because after episode 5, the moments of the four of them in the same frame are intentional and story active rather than incidental. The recurring visual of four people sharing a space without knowing it in a show that is fundamentally about the specific kind of connection that happens between people who are always in the same world but had never been given a reason to see each other is a beautiful structural idea. It says, quietly, in every episode, these four were always in each other's story. They just hadn't started telling it together yet. That idea, that the community was always there, that the connection was always possible, that what changed was not the people but the circumstances that required them to actually see each other, is the show's truest and most resonant thought. And it is there hiding in plain sight in every single episode from the very beginning. So, where does all of that leave us? After 8 episodes, after every layer opened, after every hidden detail examined, and every character arc traced to its conclusion, what is The Wonderfuls, honestly and finally, and what does it deserve? My rating is 7.4 out of 10. And I want to tell you exactly what that number means, because a number without context is just a number. It means this show gave me something real. It means I sat with it for 8 episodes and never once felt that my time was being wasted, even in the middle stretch where the pacing lost some of its momentum. It means Park Eun-bin gave one of the most committed, specific, physically intelligent performances I have seen in Korean drama this year, and that the ensemble around her matched her with a consistency that is genuinely rare in shows this size. It means the writing had ideas, real ones, not genre decoration, and pursued them with enough honesty that those ideas actually landed. It means the direction understood what the story needed and made choices in service of that understanding rather than in service of visual spectacle for its own sake. It means I thought about the show after I finished it. Not obsessively, not in the way of something that breaks your heart or reorders your understanding of what television can be, but in the quiet, recurring way of something that planted something in you that keeps finding its way back to the surface. 7.4 is not a perfect score. It is not a near perfect score. It is an honest score for a show that aimed at something meaningful and achieved most of it with real grace and stumbled in specific and identifiable places without those stumbles undoing what surrounded them. It is the score of a show I would recommend to the right person without reservation and to the general population with genuine enthusiasm. And in a landscape where genuinely good television is produced constantly and genuinely good television with a real emotional center is produced much less often, 7.4 for The Wonderfuls is a real endorsement. Now, exactly who should watch this show and why? Because I think being specific about this serves you better than a generic recommendation. If you love Park Eun-bin and came to her through Extraordinary Attorney Woo, watch this immediately. And watch it knowing that Chae-ni is a completely different character who will show you dimensions of this performer you have not seen before. The warmth is the same, the intelligence is the same, everything else is new, and the newness is exhilarating. If you are a fan of Korean ensemble comedy that carries genuine emotional weight underneath the laughs, the kind of comedy that is funny because it is true rather than funny, because it is constructed, this is the show for you. If you are someone who has watched superhero content until the genre felt exhausted and you are looking for a version of it that actually has something to say about why the premise matters, watch The Wonderfools. It will remind you that the reason superhero stories have always mattered is not the powers, it is the people who have to figure out what to do with them. And if you are someone who loves the specific texture of late 90s Korea, the nostalgia of a world before smartphones and instant connectivity and the specific kind of community that existed because presence was the only available form of connection, this show recreates that world with more love and more accuracy than almost anything else I have seen attempted. Who might not connect with this show? I want to be honest here too. If your appetite for superhero content is specifically and primarily about spectacular action, about large scale visual set pieces, about powers deployed at maximum capacity in confrontations with genuine physical stakes, The Wonderfuls will probably disappoint you. The action is good, but it is never the point, and a viewer who arrived hoping for a Korean answer to a big budget Western superhero production will find instead a character drama with superhero elements, which is a significantly different viewing experience. If you have a low tolerance for pacing that takes its time, if 8 episodes that include two relatively slow middle installments test your patience, I would still encourage you to push through. But I want to be honest that the test is real. And if your engagement with Korean drama is primarily through melodrama, through the specific emotional architecture of intense romantic suffering and dramatic declarations and high stakes emotional confrontations, The Wonderfuls operates in a quieter register than that. The romance is real and it is moving, but it is built from small things rather than grand gestures. And if the small things are not landing for you in the early episodes, the later payoff may not compensate for the journey. How should you watch this? It is on Netflix, and Netflix is exactly the right home for it. Global platform, full subtitle support, the ability to re-watch individual episodes with the ease that a show this layered genuinely rewards. Watch it on the biggest screen available to you. The production design of 1999 Haeseong City and the specific warmth of the show's cinematography deserve more than a phone screen. Watch it with someone if you can. Not because it requires discussion to be understood, but because the comedy lands harder with another person in the room, and the emotional moments are better witnessed than experienced alone. This is a show that was made to be shared. The ensemble at its center is a show about people who are better together than they are apart, and the viewing experience reflects that. It is a show for company, and if you have already seen it and you are watching this breakdown, go back. Go back with everything I told you in the spoiler section and watch it again from the beginning with the knowledge of what the scar on Ha Won-do's hand means and what the clock at 11:59 means and what the four of them appearing in the same frame before they know each other means. The second watch is a different experience, a richer one. The show was built to reward it. Give it the second watch it earned. One final thing before I close this box. What The Wonderfuls ultimately argues, through its characters, its comedy, its careful and patient emotional architecture, is something that sounds simple when stated directly, but that the show earns the right to say by spending 8 episodes proving it through specific human detail. What it argues is this: being imperfect at the most important things is not a disqualification. It is the condition, it is the universal condition. Every person who ever tried to do something that mattered did it imperfectly. Every person who ever used whatever capacity they had in service of something larger than themselves did it with full knowledge of how inadequate that capacity might be to the scale of what was needed. The Wonderfuls are not heroes despite their flaws. They are heroes because of what they choose to do with their flaws, not transcend them, not overcome them, not finally achieve the competence they were always failing to reach, but show up with the flaws fully intact and choose to be present anyway. That is the show's argument. And it is an argument worth making. It is an argument worth making beautifully, with real performers and real care, and a world that feels genuinely lived in. The Wonderfuls makes it beautifully, and I am glad I was in the room for it. Every film is a box, And we opened this one together. Thank you for spending this time with me at the film box. If this breakdown gave you something, if it changed how you see the show, or convinced you to watch it, or helped you understand why something in it hit the way it did, let me know in the comments. I read them, all of them, and the conversations that happened down there are some of my favorite conversations about film and television that I have anywhere. Drop your thoughts on the Wonderfools below. I especially want to know which character's power did you feel was most true to who they were as a person? Because I have a strong opinion and I want to know if yours matches mine. If you are not yet subscribed to the Finbox, this is the moment. Hit that subscribe button and the bell beside it because every week we open a new box and there is always something worth finding inside. The next breakdown is coming soon, and if you enjoy Korean drama, superhero storytelling, and shows that use their genre as a vehicle for something genuinely human, you will want to be here for it. I will see you there. Every film is a box, and we only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.